Hi there. Welcome to this informational step-by-step webinar on how to apply for an AmeriCorps State Formula Grant. My name is Alexis Grieve, and I'll be the host of this webinar, and I am with ServeWyoming. I'm a program manager, which means I monitor the grants for AmeriCorps. ServeWyoming is Wyoming's State Commission on National and Community Service. We exist to be the intermediary for AmeriCorps programs in Wyoming, so you will be working directly through us when you apply for your AmeriCorps grant. Today, we're going to cover the 2023-2024 AmeriCorps State Formula Notice of Funding Opportunity. I know that sounds like a mouthful. We will get through all of it, so you'll understand what I mean by the end. This webinar is helpful for both new and recompeting organizations, whether you are brand new to the AmeriCorps world, or if you have had an AmeriCorps team in the past and you are just looking to recompete for your next grant cycle. Please enjoy this webinar. We hope that it's incredibly informative. It is obviously pre-recorded, so you can watch it as many times as you need to. So what we're going to go over today are the basics of what AmeriCorps is, what an AmeriCorps team looks like, and how that can help your organization. We'll dive into the Notice of Funding Opportunity, which is otherwise known as the Request for Proposal, or RFP. You will hear us use those words interchangeably, and they both mean the same thing. That's essentially the grant that you'll be writing. We'll go over the general considerations for your proposal, what the federal government is looking for to fund, what ServeWyoming looks for to fund a grant, and then we'll go through the funding process itself. So AmeriCorps is a federally funded program, much like the Peace Corps. It is a service-based organization that places members into areas of the country that may need a little bit of assistance in nonprofit and private enterprises. In 2020, it went through a huge rebranding. A lot of people knew names of certain service programs like VISTA, NCCC, which is the National Civilian Community Corps, Volunteer Generation Fund, and those were all housed under the Corporation for National and Community Service. Although CNCS is still the legal name, in 2020, the rebranding process put all of those things under what we are terming AmeriCorps. So you will hear us use AmeriCorps frequently, and that includes a multitude of programs. But for the purposes of today's webinar, we are talking about AmeriCorps teams of members who come and serve at your organization. The mission of AmeriCorps is to improve lives and strengthen communities and to foster civic engagement through service and volunteering. And those members serve through an approved national service position. AmeriCorps members can receive a living allowance, and we will get to the maximum amount of living allowance and the other fringe benefits that they'll receive while serving a little later on in the slideshow. And probably the most enticing part of being an AmeriCorps member, besides the member experience, is that at the end of your service, you earn an education award. AmeriCorps grants can be for programs or for planning. And what this means is the program funding is to help establish an AmeriCorps team at a program that is already functioning, who may just need a little extra help, or they may be trying to expand or broaden. A planning grant, however, is for an org that has never worked with AmeriCorps and isn't quite ready to take on an AmeriCorps team, but this planning grant helps them prepare for that process. The planning grant typically is the beginning of what will eventually turn into writing a program grant. So it's kind of just the way to get your feet wet and put some roots down before you get a full-fledged AmeriCorps team. And the funds create AmeriCorps positions to help address 6 critical needs. I will talk through those 6 critical needs as we get down a little further in the slideshow. Those are the areas that AmeriCorps is really trying to impact. Funding from an AmeriCorps grant is not to pay for general organizational expenses. You really need to make sure as you're writing this grant that you're keeping in mind that this grant can only be used for the costs directly related to project and member support. If you are new to AmeriCorps State and National and you're already feeling a little bit overwhelmed, which is completely understandable, I would encourage you to go to ServeWyoming's website. That's where I would send you first and foremost. That's at www.servewyoming.org. You can see it there on the screen. We have an immense amount of resources available on our page in the grants section. So you can drill down into that and see what the actual RFP for this grant cycle looks like, as well as a lot of tutorials, webinars, and handbook walkthroughs of how to apply for such a thing. And if you still aren't satisfied with that information and you need more, you can always go to the AmeriCorps website, and that's at www.americorps.gov. So who's eligible to apply for funding? AmeriCorps grants are available for a myriad of organizations. You do not have to be a nonprofit. We're going to walk through everyone who would be considered an organization that could receive this kind of funding. So you can be a public or private nonprofit org, and that does include faith-based community organizations, grassroots movements, those kind of things that have their, own 501c3, et cetera. An institution of higher education is applicable. Government entities, labor organizations, partnerships, and sovereign nations and Indian tribes. Do bear in mind that any individuals counting time towards the project, that means any staff members that you would have allocated to be the supervisor of this AmeriCorps project, as well as the AmeriCorps members themselves, they all have to pass a national service criminal history check. Organizations convicted of federal crimes are disqualified from applying, as are lobbying groups. Those two groups are not eligible for this kind of federal funding. Applicants proposing to operate in the state of Wyoming are required to apply through us at ServeWyoming. Again, we are the state intermediary for all AmeriCorps grants and funding. So you will need to work directly with us, and I am going to tell you how. So before we get started on the application process, let's talk a little bit about what an AmeriCorps member is. AmeriCorps members are placed at an organization to work on a specific project or program. That is what the grant that you're writing will be focused on. They're able to do either direct service or capacity building. Direct service is, of course, something that is directly servicing the community, such as handing out meals at a food bank or taking down names at a health clinic. Capacity building, on the other hand, is something that will broaden the capacity of your organization, such as grant writing or educational programming, etc. They are enrolled for a specific term of service. There is an end date, so it is finite, and you need to keep that in mind. And they have a variety of amount of hours that they are considered. So a full-time member, for example, would serve 1,700 hours within their term of service. A quarter-time member would serve 450 hours. They are not referred to as volunteers, and they are not referred to as employees. We have to remember that we always refer to them as members. The reason is because a volunteer would not receive an educational award or a living allowance, but they are definitely not employees, and they are not meant to displace or supplant volunteers or employees. So please do not write a grant thinking that you can receive these members into your organization and have them take the place of a paid staff member. That is not what their intent is for. Each member has a contract with the program that they serve to ensure that they have some kind of recourse should anything go wrong. And later on in the slideshow, I will give you the information on how to find the ServeWyoming request for proposal so that you can see all of the most up-to-date info. Do bear in mind that depending on the grant cycle, a little bit of information changes, so you should always be keeping up with the most recent request for proposal. Member service terms, you can see the table there. So a full-time member, as I mentioned before, will serve a minimum of 1,700 hours within their term of service. And their minimum living allowance that they will receive for that service is $17,600. The maximum total living allowance is $35,200. And as you go down the table, you can see how those living allowances change depending on the amount of hours that the member is serving. I think this is an important thing to bear in mind, and think about the cost of living in your region or city or area when you are considering AmeriCorps members. You have to remember, some AmeriCorps members may come from your community, but a lot will not, and they will need to move into that city or region. So please bear in mind that that is the minimum and maximum total living allowance that any one of them could possibly get before deciding how big of a capacity for members you have. Member service years are, that is an acronym that you will hear us use constantly, MSYs, MSYs. MSYs are the member service years, which is really how we calculate the amount of money to give your organization through the granting process. So instead of counting a head count of actual total cumulative number of volunteers, we are counting them based on how much time their service will consist of. So a full-time member is 1 member service year. 2 half-time members is still 1 member service year. And you really need to apply for no fewer than 5 AmeriCorps members for your organization. Pardon me, that's no fewer than 5. You want a team of at least 5 for the program that you're writing this grant for. So again, you will need to remember that 5 AmeriCorps members, you'll have to look into the table to make sure that you understand how many service years that is. So if you have a quarter-time member, their MSY living allowance will not necessarily be that $17,600. It's going to be lower because they're only able to receive as many hours or as much money as their hours are. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is a webinar that is important for new programs, and I want to differentiate new from recompetes. So what does new mean to us as we're looking at these grants? It can mean a few different things. If you're a new organization, for example, an organization that has never received AmeriCorps funding before, never worked with AmeriCorps, never had an AmeriCorps team, obviously you are a new organization. You could also be considered new by being a new program. So this is maybe an organization that's had an AmeriCorps team do some kind of capacity building in the past, and now suddenly they need to build an annex onto their building so that they can accommodate an educational program, and those AmeriCorps members will be writing the programming for that education. That would be considered a new grant that you would be writing, because although you've had an AmeriCorps team before, this is a completely separate project that the new folks will be working on. And then a new application is obviously generally just an application that's not a continuation of a project that's already in the works. So the importance and why we bring attention to this is that the requirements for a new organization's grant are slightly different than a recompete. So please refer back to that ServeWyoming request for proposal, which again, I will tell you how to get to by the end of the slideshow, so that you know what additional things you need to include in your application if you're new. The types of awards are this is the table that we'll go over here. Before we discuss the different categories of AmeriCorps grants, I think you need to understand the way that AmeriCorps funding is awarded to an organization. AmeriCorps grants are 3-year commitments. The grant funds are awarded on an annual basis, and in the first year, an applicant will submit the full application for review, but then in the second and third year as a grantee, you submit your request for funding and members and a reduced amount of narrative information for review. You've already been awarded the grant. So for year 2 and year 3 of that grant cycle, you're really just showing them that you're continuing on this progress and that you have, accomplished this much, and this is what you're still working on. After the 3rd year of that grant cycle, you will have to recompete, which means that you are submitting another full application for review if you intend to continue with AmeriCorps members in that program. Organizations can apply for 2 different kinds of grants, and you can see these here in this table. They can apply for a cost reimbursement grant or for a fixed amount grant. A cost reimbursement grant funds a portion of program operating costs and the member living allowances with the flexibility to use those funds for allowable costs, regardless of whether or not the program recruits and retains all of their members, right? So those grants are available to applicants regardless of whether or not they have ever previously received AmeriCorps funding. Fixed amount grants, however, there are several different types of fixed amount grants, which you'll see on the next slide, but the overall fixed amount grants provide a specific dollar amount per member service year to an organization. But in order to access all of those funds provided, the program has to recruit and retain all the AmeriCorps members supported under that grant based on the MSY level award. New applicants who have not previously received AmeriCorps funds are not eligible to apply for fixed amount grants. So whether or not you're writing a planning grant or the very first brand new program grant, you will not be able to apply for those fixed amount grants. If you see the table here, you will notice that there's a maximum cost per member service year for that grant. So that is to cover, obviously, their living stipend, their fringe benefits, any travel, etc. But it will also help cover some of the administrative costs, and we can break down what a lot of those required costs will be. And here you can see the availability of the funds linked to enrollment and retention of members. As mentioned before, a fixed amount grant, you have to be able to retain all of your MSYs for the entire grant. Professional Corps is a little bit specialized. You'll see that box there. Those are members that are placed in communities with an inadequate number of professionals. So their salaries and benefits are paid entirely by the organization where the member serves, and that's not really included in the budget. Here at ServeWyoming, it is not that common for us to have a Professional Corps grant come through. Typically, most of the grants that you will be writing that we will be helping as an intermediary will be the traditional. AmeriCorps has 6 focus areas for funding, and these are the places that AmeriCorps really wants your grant and your program to focus on to help community build. These include disaster services, economic opportunity, education, environmental stewardship, healthy futures, and veterans and military families. So these are priorities in consideration when the federal government and ServeWyoming are looking at your program to determine whether or not we will fund your grant. We have to see in your program that one of those 6 priority areas is a pretty significant part of the program focus. If you decide to apply and you're not scared off yet by how overwhelming this can seem, these are some of the pieces that you will need to complete as we go through this process. And you'll see a schedule here in a little bit, which will give you all of the dates, but I do want to draw attention to the bottom of this page when we get there to one of the most critical dates. So if you are interested in applying, you will need to submit a mandatory concept paper if you are brand new to ServeWyoming. So if you're an organization that we've never worked with or ever heard from again before, please submit a concept paper. All of that information is again on our website. You'll need to make sure that you obtain a unique entity identifier number. That is a free service. There is no cost to that. You'll need to register and update your organization with the System for Award Management. Those are known as SAMs. And you'll have to establish an eGrants account. eGrants is the software that we use to track all of the grants that we are distributing to organizations. Having an eGrant account simply means that we're able to access your program, your project, all of your grant writing, your narratives, as well as see the amount of money that's already been allocated to you and what is still remaining in your grant. You'll need to write a high quality proposal that is responsive to the request for proposal. And we encourage you to begin your process in a Word document and then transfer that information into eGrants. If you have never worked in eGrants before, it's an amazing program and we love it. It's very thorough, but it can be a little bit fickle and finicky. So whenever you're writing your narratives, your budget narrative, your performance measure notes, you will want to make sure that you have a Word document that you are keeping that information on, that you can then copy and paste into eGrants once you have decided that you're happy with it. So the main date that we want you to keep in mind as we move forward is March 20th. You will need to submit your application and any additional documents that will be necessary for this request for proposal to the email that you see there, acprogram@servewyoming.org, by no later than March 20th of 2023 at 3 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Don't wait till the end of the day. And in fact, we really prefer if you send some of this information at least a week in advance so we can look it over and make sure that everything has been uploaded correctly so that it's not the 11th hour and everyone's scrambling to get things in. These are some of the application fields that you'll see. So in eGrants, which is, again, the software that you will make a profile in so that you're able to kind of track all of this grant funding, you'll see the following components of applications. You will be responsible for coming up with your applicant info and your budget sections. The narratives, which include the executive summary of the total program, how the program design is, the organizational capability, that's really looking at capacity of your organization to host an AmeriCorps program, the cost effectiveness and budget adequacy, and an evaluation plan. It also includes logic model, which can be a little tricky if you've never done one before. The logic model is a visual example of how you will obtain your goal through logical choices and a scheduled plan throughout the entire grant term. Then you'll see that there are performance measures, and of course you will have to include a budget. And then at the end, you'll see the authorization and certification. Back to this logic model, it is a concise visual representation of your proposal. So it is going to show the criteria that is necessary in the notice of funding opportunity, what the grant needs you to achieve to be able to receive these grant funds. And it logically aligns those elements. So it makes sure that as you are going through this and trying to figure out where you're going to put members and how you're going to best utilize your AmeriCorps team, it is systematic and it makes sense so that it flows to be the most impactful possible. A narrative requirement, which obviously there will be multiple narratives in there. You have your main narrative, which is the executive summary, but you'll also have narratives about specific performance measures. Those are required throughout, and the NOFO has specific information about how they want you to write those. You want to be succinct, but you want to be clear. So it's important to be pretty specific and measurable and never, ever assume the reviewer's knowledge. Here are some tips that we have for grant writing that we have certainly imparted these hints to other programs in the past. You really want to lead from your program strengths. You want to be passionate about what this program is, and you want to exemplify exactly what it will be able to achieve and be very explicit about that. You will want to avoid circular reasoning within your narrative. So an example of that would be, we need an AmeriCorps team to help create educational programming because educational programming is our mission to the organization. That's not purposeful, and it doesn't actually define any kind of solution. You'll want to explain how the proposed project is going to meet the criteria. And we always suggest using an impartial proofreader to have them review the entire proposal. In the process, once you have applied to this, we have peer reviewers that we use to look over all of your proposals to make sure that it makes sense to somebody from the outside. But we do have a peer review form, which is available on our website that you can always download and print out and have just an impartial friend come in and look at your grant and say what they see that makes sense and what doesn't make sense. That's really helpful as you're going through the grant writing process. Within the grant, you need to make sure that you are not writing anything into it that would include prohibited activities. These activities potentially could strip you of your funding, so they have to be adhered to. And that doesn't just mean the AmeriCorps members. It also means that any volunteers, the programs, and the staff, the paid staff members within that organization that will help supervise these members, they have to adhere to these rules. Some prohibited activities include non-duplication and non-displacement. So what that means, of course, as we talked about earlier, is that these AmeriCorps members cannot engage in activities that are currently or were previously handled by your staff members or volunteers. They are not there to replace or supplant a paid staff member. They are specifically there to work on a program or a project. And the program should be bringing new services and expanding existing services to the communities. You don't want to duplicate the same services offered in the region. That's not something that people will find worthwhile funding. And when in doubt, please feel free to ask us here at ServeWyoming. We are more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. If you're a little on the fence of like, gosh, I don't know, would that be considered allowable? Would that be okay? We would love to talk to you about that and make sure that you do it sooner than later. The budget that you should be writing needs to include some of these required expenses in it, right? So as you're creating this budget, you need to remember that within that budget, you need to have money for the criminal history checks for the staff and members that will be serving in this project. The use of the Encore reporting system, which is timesheet and living allowance allocation software that we use. There is mandatory and required travel to several ServeWyoming approved trainings up to $2,000 worth. So that needs to be considered when you're thinking about a member budget. You need to think about their living allowances and their health insurance, especially for full-time members, as well as that FICA and workers' comp, all of those fringe benefits. That's all going to be included in that amount of money that you receive to be able to pay your members. There is a 2% administrative fee that ServeWyoming retains. This is because as we act as your intermediary, we have multiple administrative costs that come with that. So your grant will also include the 2% fee that comes back to us to assist you through this. The maximum cost per MSY for your organization will be $28,800. That is the maximum CNCS share per individual. So there's an example there that if you had 25 MSYs serving in your AmeriCorps team, you would get a maximum of $720,000 from the corporation. That is the grantee or the grantor share, pardon me. The grantee has to match at least 24% of the grant for the first 3 years of funding, and that match percentage increases each year thereafter. Now, I know that sounds scary, but if you bear in mind that that match can come from cash or in-kind sources, it is actually very attainable. In-kind sources can include donations of equipment, time that people have spent on certain things to make that program work effectively. So in-kind sources are really a very easy way to achieve that 24% of match for the Corporation for National and Community Service grant share that they're giving you. But you have to document all of that information. If you don't document it, then we don't count it, and then it won't be able to be considered match. As you're writing your grant, you'll see in the grant writing section that there are performance measures, and each program has to have at least one aligned program or performance measure. So aligned means that there's an intervention with an output, and the output is the amount of service provided, and an outcome, which are the changes or benefits that occur. Now, it can be a national performance measure, which is all listed in the performance measure instructions. It can also be an applicant determined measure. So if it's something that you think is pretty specific for your program or project, that you're like, this is how we want to track this, that is definitely a possibility. Just make sure that you work with ServeWyoming so that we can ensure that that will have outcome and output. The documents that you need to attach to this application have to also be received by that March 20th deadline, and they can be submitted electronically. But again, do not wait until the last minute to begin preparing these. You'll want to make sure that each element is addressed, and you want to review your entire application and make sure that the proposal does not exceed the page limits as printed from eGrants. We recommend 10 pages in a Word document as the absolute maximum that eGrants would be able to receive. So if you are using Word as the form, the media that you are putting your grant into, all of the narratives and the budget, etc., just make sure that it does not exceed about 10 pages. Anything over that will be too much for eGrants, and you'll have to start cutting. The proposal is assessed by peer reviewers and by staff reviewers. So we compare the notice of funding opportunity requirements and the initial compliance review. We have our peer reviewers look at conflicts of interest and making sure that it makes sense, that your logic model flows, that this would be a successful program, that you would be easy to track. And then it finally comes to ServeWyoming staff, where we assess the entire proposal, at which point we will provide you with anything that needs to be clarified. And if that proposal is successful and it passes all of those peer review stages, then a program committee reviews it. The awarded applicants give a 15-minute presentation at a future board meeting, and then the committee uses the staff recommendations, the peer review, the performance score, and the presentation to determine funding recommendation. And we will begin that process in late April or early May of 2023. At that point, we submit those to the federal level. So prior to submission to the federal level, we will work with you to amend your proposal based on any feedback that we received and the committee and board recommendations. All of your applications and additional documents will be submitted to AmeriCorps from us. We are your intermediary, so we will be sending those to the feds. And they have their own review process. So you will see that notice of funding opportunity specifically lines up what their review process is. If you're following that NOFO, then you will not need to worry about what their review process looks like, because you will have already ticked all the boxes that they're looking for. They may have clarification questions as well, which you have a pretty short time frame to answer. They can bounce those back to you, and they typically need them within the week. So just bear in mind that once your things move from ServeWyoming up to the federal level, you may hear back if they have any kind of questions to make sure that they're clear on what the objective is. You better be ready to answer those pretty quickly. And they may have you revise portions of your application as well. Everyone in this process just wants you to succeed. Any of these revisions, reviews, or clarifiers that any of us need from the peer review level, the ServeWyoming staff level, the commission level, or the federal government level is only to make sure that this is the best program possible for your organization and for the AmeriCorps members that will serve there. So please remember that any of these things, we're not pushing back to be picky. We just want everything to be successful and positive. Okay, so let's say that you got funded. Then what's the next step? At that point, you begin your program startup, and that's really marketing and recruiting your own members, as well as interviewing and onboarding those members. There'll be a contract between your organization and us, ServeWyoming. And your programs are scheduled to start in August or September of 2023, and then they'll end about a year later from that. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be recruiting members in the meantime. Remember, it is up to you to find your own AmeriCorps members. We can help you through that process, but ultimately, you're recruiting your own team. But the programs should be starting in August or September of this year, so be prepared for that. There are a lot of documents. There is the Notice of Funding Opportunity, which is the same as the Request for Proposal, as I've said multiple times. You'll need to read through the attachments to make sure that you understand those, as well as the performance measures and the logic model. Then we have AmeriCorps terms and conditions and regulations that you will need to read through and make sure that you understand. But don't be intimidated by that. That is what ServeWyoming is here for. We are here to help facilitate this. So if any of this gets muddy or murky or completely overwhelming, just reach out to us. We are happy to walk you through it. If you still need help, please ask questions. We do ask that you use the AC program at ServeWyoming.org email. That is the email that we really like to house all of these grant-specific program questions into. And it ensures that we will give you a timely and accurate response. You have until March 19th to ask questions about any part of the proposal. But after March 19th, from March 19th to March 20th, you really can only ask eGrants questions. You'll want to review the Q&A document posted on our website and continue to review your documents and resources provided as you go through this process. And I think another important thing to keep in mind is there are plenty of peers around the state that have applied for and received AmeriCorps funding. There are plenty of organizations that have an AmeriCorps team or have had AmeriCorps teams, and you can always ask those folks for guidance and any kind of tips and tricks that they used to get funded. And finally, we want to go through this schedule a little bit just to make sure that you have all of the dates down that will be pertinent and important. Clearly, we are already in the open application period. We're past February 3rd, so we are ready to receive any of those applications. Again, March 20th of 2023 at 3 p.m. Mountain Standard Time is when we need the applications and additional documents due to us at ServeWyoming. In April, we'll begin the peer review of those applications, and we'll send those clarifying questions and have any kind of things that need to be, clarified on our end moving forward. Then by May 1st, the final revisions will need to be into us, and anything after that deadline cannot be considered for this application cycle. At that point, by mid-May, we give you board-approved applications. We send this to our board and our commission to look over and make sure that they're comfortable funding this. And then it gets sent to the feds. And in July, the governor announces all of the competitive and formula awards that will be received by programs around the state. So that's a pretty exciting day when it gets announced to everyone that you're receiving an AmeriCorps team. Remember, through all of this, anticipate receiving an AmeriCorps team. We are going to do our absolute best to ensure that you will be able to have a program with quantifiable and qualifiable results that is appealing to both ServeWyoming and to the federal government. So as we are going through this process, you will need to bear in mind that you need to start recruiting before your start date. So this brings us to the questions. If you need continued assistance, I would encourage you to go to our website. Again, that is ServeWyoming.org. If you click into the grants tab up at the top of the page, that should take you to an immense amount of information that is helpful and informative and that can walk you through a lot of these processes. But if you do not get the information that you need, obviously reach out to us. Again, there is that AC program email that you can use. So I want to thank you all for joining me on this webinar. I hope that you found it informative and that it helped kind of get you the grounding that you need to start this process. I know it seems incredibly overwhelming, but it's actually pretty streamlined. And as long as you continue communicating with us and working with us, it is going to be a very successful collaboration. Thank you.